So while much of the day-to-day headlines you see about sort of immigration is about the Southwest border, or this morning it's about Title 42, this book sort of came out of a frustration with the fact that we all know as immigration scholars that there's a lot more about immigration policy beyond just border and admissions policy. And that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? It's a very important part of the puzzle, but there's sort of a much deeper part of the puzzle where a lot of the anti-immigrant effort lies in our country, right? Which is in schools and businesses and communities inside our border. And so I wanted to this book comes from an interest in sort of bringing that story forward and sort of telling the story of how immigrants in the United States have a dramatically different access to rights and the social safety net than they did just 50 years ago. And so I wanted to write the story of how that happened and what this means for all of those living permanently in the United States. So I thought I too would share a few of the major themes, and let me try and share my PowerPoint. Okay. So the book, as Julian mentioned, sort of begins in the wake of the Hart-Celler Act. And sort of in addition to its role in reshaping admissions policy, the Hart-Celler Act sort of puts into place a reshaping of American society and culture. And what it does is it launches these deep debates that I look at over the place of the immigrant in American life. And as controlling the southern border proved to be very difficult for policymakers, I sort of look at how the battle to control immigrants within the United States sort of became more and more active and sort of prevalent in the political debate. And so as Julian mentioned, my book looks at these deep debates over the immigrant's place in American life in four key areas. So the beginning is education rights, labor rights, welfare rights, and civil liberties. And I chose these as four case studies because I believe they're four key arenas in which the state touches individuals' lives. So I begin the book in the 1970s with the fight over educational rights for unauthorized immigrant children in the case Plyler v. Doe. And I show how in the wake of the civil rights movement and started drawing on the tools of the civil rights movement, immigrants' rights activists actually expanded immigrants' rights sort of in ways in which liberalism persisted at this moment. And a lot of the scholarship about Plyler, sort of particularly Dr. Olivas's work, which is sort of the seminal work on it, sort of looks at the legal regime that came afterwards, but I sort of wanted to look at it as sort of through a political lens. And so I look at how both the Carter and the Reagan administrations wrestled with the case and sort of the ways in which the concerns over the 1980 election sort of shaped the case's progress and outcome, right? And this is a political cartoon from the Dallas Star Tribune, right? Ronald Reagan is the sheriff on the left, right? And you see the Governor Clements, right, saying, come back out of there, right, and get to work, right? So this is sort of, it becomes Texas in the 1980 election, right, is a very much a swing state. And so this becomes a very salient political issue. I also look in this chapter and sort of throughout the book at the new restrictionist movement that emerged in the US over the last 50 years. And this is sort of different than the one that we think of in the late 19th, early 20th century. Right, the nation was different. Racism and nativism had become less reputable. And the US has begun, right, in the previous sort of 15 years before this to really expand its welfare state with a huge variety of new benefits. And these new restrictionists that emerged at this moment sort of rejected the overtly racial arguments that we've seen in decades previously. And instead they charged that immigrants were taking government benefits away at a moment when the new economic order was leaving many citizens without economic security or opportunity, and the moment when they themselves needed the welfare state safety net the most. I trace sort of the growing power of this anti-immigrant movement during the 1980s over some battles over employer sanctions in the following two chapters that look at labor rights. I look at the efforts leading to include employer sanctions as part of the 1986 IRCA bill. But sort of interestingly, the IRCA bill, while it contains employer sanctions, they're entirely watered down and stripped of all enforcement mechanisms. And I sort of look at the politics behind how that happens. And right, this is a bill that has been continually basically introduced between 77 and 86, many times thought to be dead, that eventually gets passed. But what's passed is not what restrictionists want. And I sort of show how at this moment restriction is sort of stunted by a couple key things. One, the ways in which the parties themselves are divided, and I really go into sort of the deep debates going on in the Republican Party. The ways in which interest groups at this moment are really struggling to forge alliances, and the ways in which the fractured federal legislative process, like the process itself, the gum inside of it, sort of really sort of provides a barrier to change at this moment, as well as there are many institutional barriers at state and local levels. And one of the things that's sort of interesting is that in the wake of IRCA and the frustration with the federal policy and the failure of IRCA to curb migration, anti-immigrant activists sort of become more resolute, and they change strategy in the decades to come. And I sort of trace that change in the anti-immigrant movement. And they do that by going to the statehouses. And so the 1990s, I argue in my book, were a pivotal decade. With national politics gridlocked, the anti-immigrant groups turned to state houses and local initiatives. And so in the following chapter, I look at welfare rights and the ballot initiative Proposition 187 that comes out of California. So while the federal government the federal courts, I should say, invalidated many of Proposition 187's provisions, I show how these political successes of the measure had significant national policy implications, right? Even though it fails to be ever implemented in a significant way in California because of the federal courts, it's going to have these national policy, the politics of it is going to have national policy implications. And so I look at how conservatives use Proposition 187 as a model for proposals in the Contract with America, right, that comes with Newt Gingrich and then change after the 94 midterms. More broadly, right, they harness the ballot initiative's electoral popularity to really push the party sort of more restrictive on immigration and sort of push out some of the voices that had been pretty dominant in the party during the Reagan years. I also show how Proposition 187 had a huge impact in the Democratic Party, right? I put up this slide here and a memo from, this is actually before Proposition 187 has even passed, right? But what's going on in California raises alarm in the Clinton White House, right? I put the italicized paragraph here, right? This is one of the key aides to Rahm Emanuel in the White House, a man named Tom Epstein, writes, while any immigration-related action on the part of the administration is likely to be controversial and costly, the penalty for inaction is greater. Middle-class swing and Democratic voters are angry and they want something done. It's time for a new Democrat solution. And so what you see in the Clinton White House at this moment is this concern over California is going to play a key role in sort of internal machinations in the Clinton White House and the development of welfare reform. With the result that welfare reform is going to pass, that's going to limit the access of both authorized and unauthorized immigrants to key welfare programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps, right? So it's going to have this dramatic influence both on the left and on the right. So not only was the shift towards restriction on immigrants' access to the social safety net is one reason why the 90s are such a pivotal decade, we're also going to see huge changes and a sort of a growing erosion of civil liberties protections and sort of the legal frameworks, sort of an emergence, I should say, an emergence of the legal frameworks that sort of are at the forefront of some of today's most prevalent debates, right? So the book traces how a small town murder in a small town in Iowa leads to the creation of a federal government program called 287G, which is part of the 1996 IRIRA bill. And it basically enables and empowers state and local law enforcement officers as the frontline enforcers of immigration policy, right? The federal government now signs memorandums of understanding with state and local law enforcement to do immigration enforcement for the first time. And I argue in this chapter that citizenship status increasingly becomes sort of a litmus test for basic rights. So throughout the book, I think a couple key themes I sort of try to bring forward towards the end and sort of to tie all these sort of chapters together, right? Which is, the first is it's a temporal book, right? So between 1970 and 2000, immigrants living in the United States have witnessed a dramatic reduction in their rights and access to the social safety net. The second thing I try and really bring forward is that the 1990s ushered in a new era of immigration federalism. So here I'm engaging with the work of scholars like Karthik Ramakrishnan, Alan Coburn, Tom Wong, some of those voices, and sort of pushing them to think about the ways in which state and local action pressured federal officials to act probably earlier, right? Many of them are pointing to the 2000s, and I sort of want them to push them to look about a decade earlier. Because what you see in the 90s is that already by the 1990s, local and state action is getting federal officials either to delegate authority to the states like they do in 287G, or to conform federal immigration policy to state preferences, right, as we see with Proposition 187, right? So trying to rethink that idea of when this new era of immigration federalism begins. And the third thing that I really try and bring out throughout my work is that how the politics of immigration control has undermined the idea of citizenship for all, right? So removing non-citizen immigrants from welfare enables the removal of citizens from welfare under welfare reform, right? So 40% of Clinton's welfare reform plan, right, is financed by the removal of authorized immigrants from welfare. At the same time, right, this overall concern with entitlement spending that we see in the 90s is going to drive the removal of authorized immigrants from welfare. And the ways in which these two debates over citizenship for all, of what the notion of citizenship for all means and the politics of immigration control have been actually very fundamentally defined.